بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. So a common practice that was found in the religions of some of the earlier prophets, when they'd have children, they'd devote one child. One child would be given to the service of Allah. That was the trend. So this child is now excluded from all worldly things. Either child, him or her, is left for the ibadah of Allah Azza wa Jal. So going in that trend, Maryam alayha salam was born to her mother, who was the wife of Imran. The mother of Maryam alayha salam, her name, in some of the Mufassirin mention her name is Hanna. So Hanna, while she was pregnant with Maryam alayha salam, her husband Imran passed away. Now that's a point to remember to what we're going to mention next. So Hanna, she took an oath, she made a vow to Allah that this child that is in my belly, I make a vow that this child will be for your service, for your sake. And she was hoping that the child would be a male. When she gave birth, the child happened to turn out to be a female. So she said, Inni sammaytuha Maryam. I named this child Maryam alayhi salam. And this child now was given to the service of Allah. So they were in Baytul Maqdis. So Maryam alayhi salam went with her newborn daughter, and she told the worshippers and the scholars who were at the mosque at that time that this is a child, I took a vow that this child is going to be for the sake of Allah. So she gave them over to this mosque, to the people at Baytul Maqdis. Amongst these scholars and worshippers and caretakers of the mosque was Zakaria alayhi salam. So now Maryam alayhi salam, she was the daughter of Imran. Imran had passed away. Imran was the leader of the worshippers at the mosque. He was the leader of the scholars. So he was an esteemed person amongst them. So when Maryam alayhi salam was brought, all the people around wanted to have the honor of looking after Maryam alayhi salam. So Zakaria alayhi salam comes. He says to them that I have the most right to look after Maryam alayhi salam, because her mother is my wife's sister. So my wife is her aunt. So I am the closest to her. So I should have the right to look after Maryam. So the others around, they disagreed. They said, no, not just like that you're going to get the honor of looking after this child. So they discussed amongst themselves, what should we do? So they decided, let's draw lots and we'll see whose name comes out. Whoever's name comes out, that will be the person who will look after Maryam alayhi salam. And going into the story, there's a certain point that's our main point in the story. So they took pens. Some of the Mufassirin say that these people were scholars and they used to use pens. They used to write the Torah. So they took pens. They took these pens and they wrote their names on the pens and they threw it into the river. Some of the Mufassirin say there were around 29 of these scholars and worshippers. So they threw their pens into the river, and whoever's pen does not sink to the bottom or kind of does not get moved away with the current of the water, that's the person who will look after Maryam alayhi salam. So when they threw their pens, everyone's pens sunk to the bottom, except for Zakaria alayhi salam's pen. So he then happened to be the lucky one to look after Maryam alayhi salam. So he looked after Maryam alayhi salam. Time went by, he's looking after her. there was a special room that she used to stay in. Allah speaks about it, calling it the mihrab. That is a specific room she used to be in. When Zakaria alayhi salam used to leave her from this room, he used to lock the doors. One day, and in saying that, Zakaria alayhi salam, he had his own story with him. He was a prophet of Allah, and he wanted progeny. He wanted children. One of his reasons was that if he dies, there are others to continue the message of Islam if he dies. And he was not getting children. It reached old age, no children. And his wife was not able to have children. So, from a literal sense, from the worldly means, there seemed no reason for him to have a child. Of course, he's a prophet of Allah and he knows Allah is all capable and all powerful, so that's there. But Allah has put means in the world, how the world runs. And from that, he is an old man, his wife is not able to have children, so that boat has almost sailed. So that's with Zakaria alayhi salam. Back to our story with Maryam alayhi salam. One day Zakaria leaves from the mihrab. He locks it up, he goes away. Then he comes in again later. And he finds that Maryam alayhi salam has fruits there. Number one, where did it come from? How did it reach you? Number two, these fruits were not in season. So he is shocked. He says, أَنَّا لَكِ هَذَا. He says to Maryam alayhi salam, where did you get this? She says, هُوَ مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَرْزُقُ مَنْ يَشَاءُ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ. This is actually from Allah. And when He wants to grant somebody, He grants them with no limit. It's at that moment that something clicks in the head of Zakaria alayhi salam, and he raises his hands in dua to Allah. So what does he say? This is our point here. Zakaria alayhi salam, he says in his dua, إِنِّي وَهَنَ الْعَظْمُ مِنِّي وَاشْتَعَلَ الرَّأْسُ شَيْبًا. He says, Ya Allah, I am gone old. My bones are gone weak and frail. My hair is gone white. But I've never ever found myself to be disappointed when I've raised my hands in dua to you. وَإِنِّي خِفْتُ الْمَوَالِيَ مِنْ وَرَائِي وَكَانَتِ امْرَأَتِي عَاقِرًا. He says, Ya Allah, I want people, progeny after me who will carry on this message. And on top of that, my wife is barren. My wife cannot have children. But then what does he say? Zakaria alayhi salam, there's 2 or 3 points I want to point out. He saw this miracle of Maryam alayhi salam, so that led him to call out to Allah for a miracle. He says, فَهَبْ لِي مِن لَدُنْكَ وَلِيًّا. Therefore, bless me. هَبْ لِي مِن لَدُنْكَ ذُرِّيَّةً طَيِّبَةً. Therefore, Ya Allah, bless me with progeny. He saw a miracle, so he called out to Allah for a miracle. What few lessons do we take from this? Number one, Zakaria alayhi salam in his dua, he began it by saying to Allah, describing to Allah his situation, that I am old and I am weak and my wife cannot have children. If we want to call it in another word, he was complaining. But we learn that in dua you can pour your heart, and you should pour your heart out to Allah, describing what you want, as long as you get one word right. That word is what? that you are allowed to and should complain to Allah, but don't complain about Allah. That's the one thing. Don't complain about Allah. Number two, and this number 2 and 3 tie together. I want to point out something really amazing that the Mufassirin mentioned. This dua Zakaria alayhi salam did, Allah describes it. فَنَادَى رَبَّهُ نِدَاءً خَفِيًّا. He cried out to Allah with this dua, but it was a very silent, secret dua. Why is that? Amongst the reasons, the Mufassirin mentioned 2 main reasons. Number 1, it's very clear. Ibadat, dua that are done in secret, in private, one is closer to sincerity. There's no showing off, nobody is looking, you're sincere to Allah. But number 2, listen to this. He is an old man. He has no children. His wife cannot bear children. So he is realizing that if people hear this dua he is asking Allah, they will think he's crazy. How can this old man whose wife cannot have children ask Allah for children? But he knows who he is calling out to. So he did this secret dua because people will judge him. But him in his heart, he knows there's no limits to Allah's treasures. And that takes us to point 3, that when you call out to Allah, there's no limits. Cry to Allah, ask Allah, whatever you like. Allah's treasures are unlimited and He has promised to answer. Maybe not directly, like how we mentioned the other day. Either it will be an answer that will come sooner or later, evident like what you asked. Or number 2, we said a calamity will be turned away from you. And as I said the other night, sometimes we only realize the calamity when it's right on our doorstep. And we say, Allah saved us. That's when we think Allah saved us. Not realizing when it was far away and it didn't even reach us, that stress, something was near. We don't realize that that may be a reason of that thing being turned away was our dua. And number 3, on the day of Qiyamah, that dua will be left as a reward for us. So that dua, so when we call out to Allah, and we should call out to Allah and make sure we call out to Allah, and especially in Ramadan, especially at the time of suhoor, especially during fasting, especially at the end of fasting, just before iftar, when you're ending the ibadah of fasting, make sure to ask Allah, make sure to cry to Allah, and ask Allah for anything and everything. You're asking one whose treasures have no limits. You're asking one whose treasures have no limits. إِنَّ هَذَا لَرِزْقُنَا مَا لَهُ مِن نَفَادٍ. These things, all of the treasures and sustenance, they belong to us. There are no limits and it will never end. And it will never end. أَمْ عِنْدَهُمْ خَزَائِنُ رَحْمَةِ رَبِّكَ الْعَزِيزِ الْوَهَّابِ. Who owns? Does other than Allah own the treasures of mercy and gifts that are in the heavens and the earth? No one owns it other than Allah. And how does Allah end this verse? He says, Al-Aziz Al-Wahhab. Wahhab means someone, in this case of Allah, who gifts, but not just gifts. He gives so many gifts. He is so giving of gifts. And that's the exact word Zakaria alayhi salam uses in his dua. He says, Habli min ladunka dhurriyatan. Gift me. So those are the words Zakaria alayhi salam cries out to Allah. And then what happens? Allah says, فَنَادَتْهُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَهُوَ قَائِمٌ يُصَلِّي فِي الْمِحْرَابِ. Allah says, فَنَادَتْهُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ. He got an announcement. He calls out to Allah with this dua, a miraculous dua. And the answer comes. Allah says, فَنَادَتْهُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ. The fa in this ayah tells us what? The fa tells us that there was sequence. He prayed, then the answer came. But the fa tells us something else. Fa tells us that there was not a long duration at all between his dua and the answer. F tells us that the answer came almost immediately after his dua. Another word that would say sequence, but there was a time period. If Allah says thumma, then that means the answer came, but thumma means there's a gap. But Allah says fa. Immediately there was an answer. While he was praying in salah, while he was in salah, the angel calls out to him. The angel calls out to him. فنادته الملائكة وهو قائم يصلي في المحراب أن الله يبشرك بيحيى. Allah Azza wa Jal gives you glad tidings of a son that will be born to you, and his name is Yahya. His name is Yahya. لم نجعل له من قبل سميا. There's not been anyone named with this name of Yahya. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to accept from us and to accept our du'as, and to not make us from those who, when we call out to Allah, we don't get an acceptance, we don't get an answer. Sometimes we don't get an answer from our own sins, or sometimes we don't get an answer from haram wealth or haram food or haram drink. That is a reason that dua gets stopped. So we should be wary of these things. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على النبي الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين.